Observe the man in this CCTV footage. He didn't know it yet, but this single defiant glance would be his undoing. On October 28, 2015, at precisely 11:42 p.m., a black sedan pulled into a brightly lit but deserted gas station off Interstate 80 in rural Nevada. The stop itself was unremarkable, a fleeting moment of manufactured light in an overwhelming darkness, one of thousands that would happen that night along the lonely, hypnotic stretch of American highway. Beams of fluorescent light cut through the blackness, illuminating the concrete island of Pump 4, making the surrounding desert seem even more infinite and empty. This gas station wasn't a destination. It was a place that existed purely for transit, a brief pause for people on their way to somewhere else. But this footage, captured by a standard-definition security camera that was more a deterrent than a piece of high-tech surveillance, would become the linchpin in a multi-state investigation. For 2 agonizing weeks, it sat on a hard drive, an unnoticed and meaningless collection of data. But it was here, in this silent 27-second clip, that the last known image of a predator and his victim was frozen in time. The driver, who would later be identified as Robert Caldwell, a 48-year-old long-haul truck driver with a spotless employment record, never even gets out of the car. He simply pulls in, aligning the driver's side with the pump, as if intending to refuel, and then he stops. The engine idles, the car a dark, anonymous shape against the harsh lighting. In the footage, his face is a mask of calm, a portrait of middle-aged mediocrity. He has short hair, a plain blue polo shirt, and the weary expression of a man who has spent too many hours on the road. But his eyes tell a different story. For 7 uninterrupted seconds, his gaze is fixed directly on the camera lens. It's not a curious glance or a flicker of paranoia. It is a deliberate, unblinking stare, a moment of direct communication with the unfeeling machine watching him. It is a look of profound arrogance, almost a challenge, as if he is daring the world to see him. Beside him, barely visible in the dim light of the car's interior and slumped against the passenger window, is 19-year-old college student Alex Hayes. Alex had been reported missing 72 hours earlier after his evening study session at the University of Nevada, Reno campus library.
In this final, haunting image, he appears to be asleep, his head resting against the cool glass, his face obscured by shadow. He is completely still, a passive figure in a scene controlled entirely by the man in the driver's seat. He is oblivious to the camera, oblivious to the man sitting inches away from him, and oblivious to the fact that his life was about to be erased. To understand why this grainy image became so important, you have to go back 72 hours to a brightly lit library filled with the quiet hum of students preparing for midterms. Alex Hayes was a sophomore, a solid student studying engineering, known for his quiet demeanor and his methodical study habits. He wasn't a partier. His life revolved around his classes, his small circle of friends, and his weekly calls home to his family in California. On the night of October 25th, he told his roommate he was going to the library to finish a paper and would be back late. It was a completely normal Tuesday, but he never came back. When he wasn't in his bed the next morning, his roommate wasn't immediately alarmed. Maybe he'd stayed with a friend or pulled an all-nighter in a 24-hour study lounge. But by midday, a knot of unease began to tighten. Alex wasn't answering his phone, and his friends hadn't seen him. His parents, after a dozen frantic, unanswered calls, contacted campus police. The initial investigation was slow and followed a frustratingly familiar pattern. Police interviewed his friends and professors. They found his laptop and textbooks on a desk in a quiet corner of the library, exactly where he said he would be. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing was out of place. The last piece of communication anyone had from him was a single text message sent to a friend at 9:15 p.m. It simply said, "Hey, heading out. getting a ride to clear my head for a bit." That one message would send the investigation down the wrong path for days. It suggested that Alex had left willingly. To the police, it painted the picture of a stressed-out college kid taking a spontaneous break. It lowered the initial alarm, shifting the focus from a possible abduction to a simple case of a young adult who had decided to go off-grid.
But his parents knew better. Alex wasn't spontaneous. He was a creature of habit, a planner. He wouldn't just leave his laptop, his wallet, and his keys behind. As the hours turned into days, their pleas grew more desperate. His digital footprint vanished. There was no activity on his debit card, no updates to his social media, no pings from his phone after that last text. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the library and dissolved into thin air. For 13 days, there was nothing. The campus searches turned up no new clues. The local news ran his picture for a few nights, but the story soon faded, replaced by newer, more immediate headlines. The official investigation had stalled, leaving the Hayes family in a state of suspended agony, trapped in a nightmare of silence and uncertainty. It was a case that was rapidly going cold, a file that was on the verge of being added to a growing pile of unsolved disappearances, another face on a poster that would eventually be taken down. The trail had not just gone cold, it had vanished before it ever truly began. The break, when it finally came, arrived not from a frantic phone call or a surprise witness, but from the silent, methodical work of an FBI analyst brought in to assist the overwhelmed local police. Her name was Diane Miller, a specialist in digital forensics who believed that in the modern world, nobody could truly vanish without leaving a faint electronic echo behind. While the ground search had yielded nothing, Alex Hayes had left one such echo, that final text message. For 2 weeks, the investigation had been hung up on the content of the message, the idea that Alex had left willingly. Miller decided to ignore the words and focus on the signal itself. The last ping from Alex's phone didn't provide a neat dot on a map. Instead, it gave them a wide triangular slice of the Nevada landscape, a massive search area bisected by a single lonely artery, Interstate 80. The phone had connected with a cell tower that serviced a 50-mile stretch of that highway. Physically searching such a vast and desolate area was impossible. It was a landscape of sagebrush, dust, and crushing emptiness. But Miller proposed a different kind of search. She argued that on a route like I-80, the only points of human interaction, the only places with eyes, were the handful of gas stations, motels, and truck stops that dotted the highway like lonely lighthouses in an ocean of darkness. She initiated a systematic and frankly tedious request for all commercial surveillance footage from every business within that 50-mile corridor on the night Alex vanished. It was a digital dragnet, a long shot based on the hope that Alex, and whoever he was with, had passed within the frame of one of these forgotten cameras. For days, the process was a mind-numbing exercise in futility. A team of agents watched hours upon hours of low-resolution footage. They saw a monotonous parade of tired travelers, anonymous 18-wheelers, and the nocturnal rhythms of a world in transit. It was a digital haystack, and they weren't even sure if there was a needle inside. Then, on the third day of review, an agent flagged a file from a small, independently owned gas station. The file was labeled Pump 4. The timestamp was 11:42 p.m., October 28th. The location was right in the center of their search grid. The footage showed a nondescript black sedan. At first, it seemed like just another car. But the agent zoomed in. He could just make out the shape of a second person in the passenger seat. He rewound the clip and played it again. And then he saw it, the driver's face turning slowly, deliberately, to look straight at the camera. He called Miller over. When they ran the license plate, it came back clean. It was registered to a Robert Caldwell of no fixed address with a P.O. box in Arizona. The name meant nothing to them, but when they cross-referenced the image with the Department of Motor Vehicles database, they got a hit. The face on the driver's license matched the man in the video. The analysts enhanced the image from the passenger side, cleaning up the grainy pixels as best they could. The shape became a person. The person was a young man with dark hair, his head against the window. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the same one Alex Hayes was wearing when he was last seen on library cameras. Suddenly, the entire context of the investigation shifted. This wasn't a story about a kid who walked away. This was a story about a kid in a car with a stranger, 150 miles from his campus, late at night, looking completely inert. The footage was less than 30 seconds long, but it told a chilling story. Robert Caldwell doesn't get out of the car. He doesn't buy gas. He simply pulls in, idles for a moment, and then performs his 7-second stare. It was this stare that transformed the video from a routine piece of surveillance into a key piece of evidence. This was not the furtive, nervous glance of someone trying to avoid detection. It was the calm, steady gaze of someone who was utterly confident, someone who was either unaware of the consequences or, more terrifyingly, indifferent to them. To the seasoned investigators watching the clip on a loop, it felt like a signature. It was a gesture of dominance, a silent boast. The contrast between the driver's intense awareness and the passenger's complete passivity was the final damning piece of the puzzle. The theory that Alex had left willingly was immediately and permanently discarded. This was an abduction. The missing person file was closed and a new one was opened. The search for Alex Hayes had become the hunt for Robert Caldwell. A warrant for Robert Caldwell's arrest was issued before dawn. His face, pulled from the DMV database and sharpened by FBI technicians, was broadcast across the country. The gas station footage, now the centerpiece of a national news story, played on a loop. That 7-second stare became an image of pure menace, a silent confession captured on a forgotten videotape. The investigation shifted from a desperate search for clues into an urgent, nationwide manhunt. But the man they were hunting was a ghost. When investigators tried to build a profile of Robert Caldwell, they found themselves staring into a void. He had no permanent address, just a P.O. box in a dusty Arizona town that he hadn't checked in over a year. He had no credit history, no bank accounts, no social media presence. He paid for everything in cash, a discipline that in the digital age was a deliberate and effective way to remain invisible. He was a man who had systematically erased himself from the modern world. The only records they could find were with the Department of Transportation. Caldwell was a licensed long-haul truck driver. This discovery was a chilling revelation. It explained everything: his transient lifestyle, his ability to move across the country without raising suspicion, his access to the vast, anonymous network of highways that crisscrossed the nation. The interstate wasn't just his workplace, it was his hunting ground. His employment history was a patchwork of short-term contracts with a dozen different freight companies over the last decade. He never stayed in one place for long. He'd drive for a few months, deliver his cargo, collect his pay in cash, and move on. His former employers described him as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. He was the kind of person who was designed to be forgotten, the background character in 1,000 other people's lives. But now investigators had a new tool: his work logs. They began the painstaking process of mapping his routes over the past 10 years. It was a chaotic spiderweb of lines that stretched from California to Ohio, from Texas to Washington. As the map took shape, a horrifying new dimension to the case began to emerge. The FBI started cross-referencing Caldwell's routes with a national database of unsolved missing persons cases. They narrowed the search parameters, males aged 18 to 25 who had disappeared near major highways. The first potential hit came from a cold case in Utah from 2013. A 20-year-old student had vanished from a bus stop just off Interstate 15. His last known communication was a text to his girlfriend saying he was trying to hitch a ride home. The case had gone cold within a month. Caldwell's work logs showed he had passed through that exact area on the night the student disappeared. On its own, it was a coincidence. But then another match appeared. A 22-year-old who went missing from a rest stop in Wyoming in 2014. He had been on a cross-country road trip when his car broke down. He called his father, said he was going to try and get a ride to the next town to find a mechanic. He was never heard from again. Caldwell had been there too. One by one, the cases began to pile up. A young man who disappeared from outside a concert venue in Oregon.
Another who vanished while backpacking in Colorado. Each case was a separate tragedy, a mystery that had tormented a different family in a different state. They were isolated incidents, unconnected until Robert Caldwell's face provided the terrifying link. Investigators now knew they were not looking for a man who had abducted one college student. They were hunting a prolific serial killer who had been operating undetected for at least a decade, using America's highways as his personal, rolling trap. The 7-second stare at the gas station camera was no longer just an act of arrogance. It was the mistake of a predator who had become so confident, so certain of his own invisibility, that he had finally allowed the world a glimpse behind the mask. The manhunt intensified. His face was plastered at every truck stop, every way station, every diner along every major interstate. The public was warned that he was considered armed and extremely dangerous. For 3 agonizing days, the trail remained cold. It seemed Caldwell had once again dissolved back into the anonymity of the road. Investigators feared he would simply change his appearance, get a new truck, and start again under a different name. The vastness of the country, once his greatest asset, now felt like an insurmountable obstacle for those trying to find him. Every passing hour increased the chance that he would slip through their fingers for good, taking his secrets with him. The Hayes family could only watch as the story of their missing son morphed into a national horror story, his face now just one among a growing gallery of victims. The hope of finding him alive had all but evaporated, replaced by a desperate need for justice and a dread of what they would find when Caldwell was finally caught. The break that finally cornered the ghost came not from advanced surveillance or a high-tech tracking device, but from a simple, human observation. It came from a waitress named Sarah, working the graveyard shift at a remote truck stop diner in eastern Utah. She was a woman who had spent 20 years pouring coffee for men with tired eyes and long roads ahead of them. She knew their faces, or at least the types of faces that passed through her world. On the 3rd day of the manhunt, just after 2 a.m., a man walked in and sat alone in a corner booth. He was quiet and ordered black coffee.
Sarah didn't think much of it until she glanced up at the small television mounted above the counter. A national news network was replaying the story, and on the screen was the face from the gas station footage. She looked from the TV to the man in the booth and back again. The face was the same. The cold, steady eyes were the same. A jolt of adrenaline shot through her, a mixture of fear and civic duty. Her hands trembling slightly, she walked into the kitchen, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed 911. She kept her voice low, her words steady, describing the man in the black sedan she'd seen him park out back. When state troopers arrived minutes later, they did so quietly, without sirens. They entered the diner from the front and back, surrounding the booth. Robert Caldwell didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon or try to run. When he saw the officers, he simply placed his hands flat on the table, as if he had been expecting them. He surrendered without a word, his expression as blank and unreadable as it was in the gas station footage. The manhunt was over, but the true horror of his crimes was only just beginning to be uncovered. In the trunk of his car, tucked away in a spare tire compartment, they found a worn leather backpack. It belonged to Alex Hayes. Inside, they found his college ID and a half-finished book of crossword puzzles. And underneath that, they found a collection of disposable cameras, the kind you buy at a drugstore and drop off to be developed. There were over a dozen of them. When the FBI's forensic lab developed the film, the full scope of Robert Caldwell's reign of terror became sickeningly clear. The developed film contained dozens upon dozens of photographs. They were all portraits of young men, all asleep, all taken from the driver's seat looking over at the passenger. The angle was always the same. The photos were like a hunter's trophies, a chilling catalog of his victims at their most vulnerable.
The background changed. A desert landscape at dawn, the blur of city lights at night, the anonymous interior of the car, but the subject was always the same. A young man, oblivious, his life captured in a final, quiet moment before it was stolen from him. Using the photos, investigators were finally able to put names to the faces of the missing, connecting Caldwell definitively to the cold cases in Utah, Wyoming, Oregon, and Colorado. The photos were his undoing, a piece of physical evidence that contradicted his carefully constructed digital invisibility. Robert Caldwell was eventually convicted of the murders of Alex Hayes and 4 other young men, though authorities suspect the true number of his victims is much higher. During the trial, the key piece of evidence presented by the prosecution was the 30 seconds of footage from the Nevada gas station. They played the clip for the jury again and again. The prosecutor argued that his 7-second stare was the most honest thing Robert Caldwell had ever done. It wasn't a mistake, it was a signature. It was the act of a supreme narcissist, a predator who had become so convinced of his own superiority and his own invisibility that he had dared the world to look at him. He believed he was a ghost, moving unseen through the veins of the country, and in that moment he had paused to admire his own reflection in the camera's lens, not realizing that the world was finally looking back. The footage is now a permanent part of the curriculum at the FBI Academy in Quantico. It's used in behavioral analysis training as a case study, a chilling example of what they call predatory clairvoyance. The moment a killer, secure in his anonymity, lets his mask slip. It teaches new agents that sometimes the most crucial evidence isn't found in a fingerprint or a strand of DNA, but in a fleeting, silent gesture, a non-verbal confession captured by a forgotten camera at a lonely gas station in the middle of the night. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content.